About peace, love, and understanding by Elvis Costello. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to Guatemala, where a retired military general has won the first round in the country's presidential election. He faces a runoff election in November. If elected, General Otto Pérez Molina would become the first former military official to win the presidency since the end of the military dictatorships in 1986. Human rights groups have accused Pérez of being directly involved in the systematic use of torture and acts of genocide in Guatemala in the 1980s. Pérez has run largely on a platform of using an iron fist to crack down on drug cartels.
This is a right that I accept, that I am going to fight with character and with a firm hand in front of the institutions to bring peace and security and defend the lives of all Guatemalans so we can live with security as we deserve.
Some news accounts have cited voters who say they support Molina in hopes that he'll help restore law and order to the country, which has been ravaged by violence. Nearly 6,000 people were killed last year in Guatemala, a nation slightly smaller than Tennessee in size, with a population of about 14 million. Well, to discuss the elections and their implications, we're joined by human rights attorney Jennifer Harbury. Her husband, Fran Bamaca Velasquez, a guerrilla commander, Mayan comandante in guerrilla, was disappeared after he was captured by the Guatemalan army in the 1980s. She's the author of Searching for Everardo, a story of love, war, and the CIA in Guatemala, has spent decades pressing for classified information on her husband's case. She has new evidence linking General Otto Pérez Molina, the leading presidential candidate, with her husband's death. Talk about the significance of his win in the first round of the elections, Jennifer.
Well, we're all extremely concerned given his background in human rights violations in Guatemala. He's always declared that he was not involved in the genocidal campaign of 1982 in the Quiché Highlands, but in fact a video showing Alan Nairn interviewing him precisely as he stands over several battered corpses has been making the rounds in Guatemala. He was a major at the time, and this, of course, was the year when 70 to 90% of the villages in the Ichil Triangle were razed. He also appears or is named in a WikiLeaks cable by Ambassador McFarland, in which he admits that he was up there and in a command position, even though he was using the name of Tito Arias. In my husband's case, of course, if we take all of the documents together, including some telegrams that I recently received from the Guatemalan military, it shows that Everardo, my husband, was helicoptered directly after his capture, directly into a huge meeting of high-level intelligence and other military officers, between 50 and 80, according to different documents, at the Santa Ana Berlin base, which was the central headquarters for the military operations at the time. At that meeting, the decision was made with Pérez Molina present, and also the person directly in charge of him and the head of the Estado Mayor de Defensa Nacional, General Perusina. The decision was made to place Everardo in a special intelligence prisoner of war program by which the prisoner was tortured long-term without killing him in order to break him psychologically and force him to collaborate. Who was head of intelligence at that moment was Otto Pérez Molina. He was at that meeting, and in order to conceal those facts so that the human rights community would not intervene, given that they had just signed the human rights accords on human rights as part of the peace process, they decided at that meeting to kill a young soldier, place him at the combat site, and later falsely claim that that was the body of my husband in order to prevent that intervention. The rest of the documents show that in 1992 and 1993, while Otto Pérez Molina was head of intelligence, that not only was Everardo taken from intelligence compound to intelligence compound to intelligence compound, tortured by intelligence specialists and transported in intelligence helicopters and held for a long time and probably killed at the intelligence death squad base in the capital. But there were 300 to 350 other prisoners of war in the same conditions, being thrown down wells out of helicopters, et cetera, et cetera. By the time the United States Embassy told the truth about what was happening, of course, all of those people were killed. And I think it's very important to note that the embassy is still protecting Otto Pérez Molina, suggesting that somehow the evidence hasn't stuck. The evidence has never been allowed to go to courts, in fact. And they seem to insinuate that Mr. Pérez Molina really wasn't involved and is the great reformist.
But the WikiLeaks cables do indicate that the State Department officials are concerned about the impact on Pérez Molina and another one of the former colonels of that day, as they see them now as the great political hopes in the current times.
Well, Pérez Molina, of course, trained at the School of the Americas. Alan Nairn's article presents some strong evidence that he was probably a CIA link, which I think is most likely. He was head of intelligence, and he rose to power at that time, and again was trained in the United States and has excellent relationships with the United States. So I think that's probably true. I think one other thing that's of great concern to remember with the election is that he was up in the Nebak and Ichil Triangle in a position of command throughout the massacres. In this coming election, a large percentage of the Mayan survivors will not be able to vote because of de facto Jim Crow laws. In the 90s, that number was half of the indigenous women and between a quarter to a third of the men. The numbers are better now, I believe, but no one in Guatemala, including the Electoral Board, has been able to produce those statistics. They seem to toss those out as not really relevant. In addition, people forced into exile, hundreds of thousands, a large percentage of them will not be able to vote either. And in addition to that, Pérez Molina has managed to kick Sandra Torres, his only realistic opponent, off the ballot. So to say the least, this is a very skewed election. The New York Times article suggested that people would vote for Pérez Molina because they wanted an iron fist to combat the rising violence, but most of that is being carried out by military leaders who took their uniforms off after the war, created large mafias to run drugs, and hired and trained gangs such as the Zetas, that's very well documented, to help them run the drugs.
And this is a phenomenon that not only in Guatemala, but Salvador has had a similar problem. Escalation of violence. Once the wars ended, as many of these former soldiers and death squad people then became involved in narco trafficking.
That's correct. And the kinds of assassinations and mutilations that we're seeing are almost like signature killings from straight out of the 80s. And in fact, the head of the survivor network in the Nebak area was tortured to death only recently, as a sort of de facto warning that people should not press the 10 paradigmatic cases. The next one up at bat is genocide.
In a moment, we're going to talk about a new documentary that's just premiering in New York called Granito. But Jennifer, you have been on this trying to discover what happened to your husband and through him what happened to so many for decades. The information you have now about Otto Pérez Molina, you have fasted for information in front of the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala. You risked death numerous times. How significant is this? And what about the fact you have this as it looks like Pérez Molina will be the next president of Guatemala?
We believe that the 10 paradigmatic cases of war crimes, which the international community and the Inter-American Court has been backing to try to break the impunity for once and for all so that people don't continue to kill. Right now, no problem. It's one of the highest murder rates in the world, but everyone knows nothing's going to be done about it. But we believe that once Otto Pérez Molina comes into the presidency, he'll get rid of Claudia Paz, the fantastic and brilliant new Attorney General, and stack all of the courts, and the killings of judges and witnesses and people like myself will, of course, increase to the point that the whole aperture for de facto Nuremberg for Guatemala, which is so crucial, we think that Nuremberg will shut down.
Are you afraid to go back to Guatemala?
Well, Otto Pérez Molina told the ambassador, McFarland, that he was very worried that his political opponents would have me killed to make me look bad. And I was almost arrested recently on the grounds that I should not have pushed the Inter-American ruling requiring the case to be reopened, among other things. So, but I'll go back down because what am I facing compared to the Guatemalans like Freddie Petrelli here?
And we're nothing. Talk with Freddie as well as Pam Yates, the filmmaker, and Jennifer Harbury. When we come back, Jennifer Harbury, human rights lawyer, widow of Efraín Bamaca Velázquez, went on hunger strikes in Guatemala City and Washington to press for classified information about her husband's case. Author of Searching for Everardo, A Story of Love, War, and the CIA in Guatemala, and also the book Truth, Torture, and the American Way. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
Qué mal quedó el general. Qué mal quedó el general. Con tanta muerte
That song, Otto Pérez Molina, El General de la Muerte, the General of Death. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, a new documentary about Guatemala links the country's turbulent past with those like General Otto Pérez Molina, who are active players in its present. Granito, How to Nail a Dictator, part political thriller, part memoir, spans 4 decades. It follows several people, including the film's director, Pamela Yates, as they search for the details that can be used to hold accountable those responsible for genocide. This is a portion of the film's trailer.
Ever since I filmed these generals in 1982, I've wanted to see them pay for their crimes.
It is so hard to nail senior military officers who ordered this. When you want to indict a dictator, you need evidence.
Witnessing is the essence of being a documentary filmmaker. Capturing moments in time, never knowing how history will judge them.
People have it in their minds that anyone can be killed in Guatemala for nothing.
When I think about independence, I get really angry. You know, I get really pissed.
It came addressed to me, so it says, Freddy, tenemos a la vista.
We're watching your kids' schools and where you work.
En partes lo regaremos por la ciudad.
We'll scatter your parts throughout the city.
Nunca vamos a callarnos.
We will never remain silent.
Quiere callarnos.
Rios Mon wants to silence us, but he can't.
Mi nombre tiene un...
My name has a meaning.
Antonio quiere decir,
Antonio is the one
es el que enfrenta con
who confronts the enemy.
If we Maya people don't unite, we won't survive.
So when we come along and do this kind of work, they're afraid. They're afraid, and they should be afraid, because we're coming after them.
That's an excerpt from the film Granito, How to Nail a Dictator, opened here in New York at the IFC last night. For more, we're joined by the director, Pamela Yates. She narrates the film's central story about the search for evidence of Guatemala's genocide, much of it drawn from footage she filmed in 1982 for her award-winning documentary, When the Mountains Tremble. At least 200,000 Guatemalans died during the genocide. We're also joined by Freddie Petrarelli, director of the Guatemalan Forensic Anthropology Foundation. In the film, he leads teams to unearth mass graves in a search for those killed by the military, all the while facing threats himself from clandestine groups that want the truth to stay buried. He's who you just heard in that trailer. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Pam, this latest film, talk about its significance in light of the presidential elections that are taking place right now.
Well, Granito is really about the importance of human rights documentation, not just as a filmmaker and going into all of my filmic outtakes from 1982 to find additional evidence for the case in Spain and the cases in Guatemala, but also the other human rights defenders, Freddie Petrarelli, who's been finding and looking for scientific forensic evidence, Kate Doyle, who is going through secret military and police documents to find evidence, including evidence against Otto Pérez Molina, who is part of Plan Sofia, one of the documents that was leaked to her and which you see in Granito. So the big idea of the film is how important it is to continue to document and how important this documentation is for evidence in the cases.
Pamela, in the film you talk about how difficult it has been to prove that former President and General Efraín Ríos Montt knew what the Guatemalan military was doing when the government denied any knowledge of the genocide and said there were no Army records. I want to play a clip from Granito when forensic scientist Kate Doyle explains how she was approached by someone in Guatemala with a package that contained information that would prove especially useful in documenting the counterinsurgency sweep.
Plan Sofia is a collection of documents that were created in July and August of 1982, documenting a counterinsurgency sweep that took place in central Quiché. It describes the mission of the operation as the extermination of subversive elements in the area. It's very much a product of the Rios Montt army. Now, this patrol report is created in order to show the commander that they did what they were told. This is exactly the kind of communication that we need to prove that there was a two-way flow of information, and that the high command was not ignorant of what the patrols on the ground were doing. From the perspective of a prosecutor or an investigator, it is so hard to nail the intellectual authors of these crimes. It is so hard to nail the senior military officers who ordered this. So Plan Sofia is a very significant explosive document.
That was Kate Doyle, senior analyst with the National Security Archive, in the film Granito. Pam Yates, why do the film now, following up, how many decades after you did your first film?
I think it was really because the international attorneys in the genocide case being heard in the Spanish National Court asked me to go into all of my filmic outtakes.
And explain that more, the Spain case.
The Spain case is a case under the principle of universal jurisdiction, where some crimes are so horrible, like genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, that if they're not being prosecuted in the country of origin, that any country in the world that signed the Genocide Convention should be able to take on and prosecute those criminals. But one of the effects that the Spanish National Court case has had is that it has emboldened judges and prosecutors in Guatemala to pursue their own cases for genocide. And in fact, the first Army officer in the history of Latin America has just been arrested in June for genocide. So we're beginning to see a tipping point for justice, one of the things that Jennifer said would stop if Otto Pérez Molina were elected. But I believe, and I think the sense of granito, which is that we all have a tiny grain of sand to contribute to this judicial process or positive social change, means that we really have to support this tipping point for justice in Guatemala, both inside the country and from outside the country. And we hope that Granito, the film, will contribute to this.
Freddie Pacharelli, you've been involved in this now for quite some time in terms of digging up the scientific evidence of how the genocide occurred and who were the victims. Could you talk about how you got involved? And, of course, these days, the wars are forgotten in Central America, and now everyone assumes that it's a new day. But the threats that you've been facing, if you could talk about that as well.
Well, I got involved, and I used to live in New York, and my family fled here in 1980 because of death threats to my father, and eventually, when I was in Brooklyn College, I sort of wanted to reconnect with Guatemala and found Dr. Clyde Snow, who invited me to go to Guatemala and take a course with the team, and eventually I stayed there for 16 and a half years. During that time, we've exhumed over 1,400 different communities where these massacres or extrajudicial executions occurred. And as a result, we have been getting death threats for the last 10 years. The most recent ones come immediately after the sentencing of the 4 military personnel ex-Caibiles in the Dos R's massacre. About 4 days later, we got a death threat handwritten in red ink, telling us...
I want to go to a clip that has you reading one of these death threats. You talk about this threatening letter that was sent to your workplace. This is from Granito. It's Freddie.
It came addressed to me, so it says, Freddie,
now we have what we wanted. All the information in our hands. Today you will all pay, sons of... We have pictures and information of your family. We know your kids' schools and where you work. Your days are numbered. The Forensic Anthropologist Foundation won't ever be able to save you. 2 or 3 armored cars won't save you. Your family will pay for everything. Damned revolutionary sons of... Your bodies will land in graves. We'll scatter your pieces throughout the city. Your family, sons, nephews, sisters, and parents will pay for everything, sons of... The Forensic Anthropologist will pay.
and it finishes by saying death.
That's Freddie Petrelli in Granito, the forensic anthropologist who will not stop. Freddie, who is threatening you?
Well, in reality, we don't know, but the truth is that we believe is the military personnel that are afraid of the evidence that we're presenting, and that is being used against them in court trials. In this last death threat, we know is people that are linked to the military personnel that were found guilty and were sentenced to 6,060 years in jail each, 30 years for each one of the deaths, and 30 years for crimes of lesser humanity. So it's the people who committed the crimes that are threatening us, and they have let us know this.
I want to ask you, because we had in headlines the report about developments in Colombia, where the former head of Colombia's secret police, the DAS, was sentenced to 25 years for his involvement in working with the death squads to supervise the killings, especially of a sociologist who was involved in investigating the death squads there. I want to ask you, you've spent now 16 years, you say, doing this work in Guatemala. Why, even in a country like Colombia, are some people being brought to justice for what's happening? But yet in Guatemala, where the genocide was so much more extensive, it's been so difficult to hold those who were the intellectual authors and the people supervising the killing responsible?
Well, in Guatemala, what has happened is pretty much blanket impunity after the signing of the peace accords, and people are afraid. The prosecutor's office has not been moving forward with these cases till now that we have Claudia Paz y Paz, the new Attorney General. And although there's evidence of the crimes, not only physical evidence, but testimonial evidence, the prosecutors have been very afraid and have not gotten support. Most of the people who participated at a high level are also still in positions of power. General Efraín Ríos Montt still today is in Congress. So that has contributed to a lack of justice.
Pam, the footage you have of Freddie and his team digging up these bodies. Freddie, if you can explain what exactly you're doing, where are you finding these mass graves, and how are you identifying them?
Well, most of the mass graves that we've dug up during the last 19 years are in the communities in the highlands, and these are the victims of massacres. But recently, we've also found that a lot of the bodies of the people that were forcibly disappeared, after they were tortured, interrogated, tortured, they were executed and thrown in the streets of cities, Guatemala City being one of these cities. And then the bodies would be autopsied in some cases and taken to cemeteries like La Verbena Cemetery. What we're doing now is we're looking for the bodies of the people that were disappeared and buried as John or Jane Does or unidentified bodies. In La Verbena, what happened is after they were buried in individual graves, after some time, because of lack of space, they take the bodies out and they throw them in these huge bone wells. There's 4 of them. So far we've exhumed over 12,500 bodies, and we believe at least 1,000 of those bodies are bodies of victims of forced disappearance.
And the connections to September 11th every which way. The election that led to the, well, this runoff election was September 11th that elected Pérez Molina, though he has to go through another election. And the scientific, the tools you're using come from 9/11.
That is correct. We are using Emphasis. It's a software developed by the company Gene Codes. It was developed for the identification of the victims of 9/11. This software was donated to the foundation so we can compare the genetic profiles from the victims, the skeletons, to the genetic profiles of the families. So, you know, the fact that I grew up in New York, and I saw the effort put in to identify the victims of 9/11, I thought was important in my decision of looking for the victims of forced disappearance in Guatemala. And we've taken the technology and also the spirit of New York into Guatemala to look for the lost Guatemalans or the disappeared Guatemalans.
And this issue that some of the press reports here in the New York Times and other publications are talking about how support for Pérez Molina is coming largely from young people who have no knowledge of the situation that happened and the genocide of 30 years ago, and but the violence that's occurring now in the streets of Guatemala City and Salvador and these other places, the impact of this and the connection to the wars and the genocide of the 80s.
Well, the connection is clear because of the lack of justice in the crimes of the war in Guatemala. It has let people know that they can pretty much do anything and get away with anything in Guatemala. And that has propagated, the drug cartels to become stronger, as well as the gangs and the maras to also become stronger and become tools in a political game to make it seem like there is no hope other than to elect a former general.
And the connection of the politicians with the drug cartels, because apparently not just Pérez Molina has been implicated, but several other candidates who are running for president as well.
Yes, there's, according to the press, there's connections to the drug cartels everywhere in Guatemala.
And are you afraid, if Pérez Molina is elected, of it making your identification of these bodies and digging more difficult, more death threats coming?
Of course we're afraid. Because of his direct ties to the conflict, it would only seem logical that he is not interested in us doing this work. Nonetheless, I do have to say that we have been able to work even when the FRG, which is Efraín Ríos Montt's party, was in power. So I think the work is too powerful to be shut down, but individually, yes, we're afraid.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. The film Granito, How to Nail a Dictator, is playing at the IFC here in New York. It just premiered last night. These days that it is here in New York determine whether it will be seen in cinemas around the country. It is a remarkable film. It is called Granito, which means grain of sand, How to Nail a Dictator. Freddie Petrelli, thanks so much for being with us, and Pam Yates for doing this film and all the work that you have done. This is Democracy Now! Happy birthday, Sam Elkoff. Thanks for joining us.